First lesson this morning, our Old Testament reading comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, starting at verse 17 through verse 30. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples and nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines, have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and of gold, of bronze and iron, of wood and of stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and his writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have weighed in the balances and have been found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Here ends our first reading. Our second reading this morning comes from Paul's epistle to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 7 through 16. But what things were gained to me, these I have counted as loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things lost for the excellence of the knowledge of Jesus Christ my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having my own righteousness which is from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, if by any means I may attain to the resurrection from the dead. Not that I have already attained or am already perfected, but I press on, that I may lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. I press towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Therefore let us, as many as are mature, have this in mind. And if anything you think otherwise, God will reveal even this to you. Nevertheless, to the degree that we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule. Let us be of the same mind. And our gospel lesson comes from the first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, beginning at verse 14 through verse 30. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's days they will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. And immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Here ends our reading. Well, of course, the news in the last few weeks has talked quite a bit about the peaceful transition of power from one presidential administration to another. And we look in the scriptures and we find that the passing of administrations was not nearly anything peaceful whatsoever. In Daniel's time, in the year 587 BC, the Babylonians entered into Jerusalem and conquered the city. And the citizens of Judah, many of them were hauled away into captivity. And included among those who were taken into captivity were the prophet Daniel and 3 other young men from the royal court. We know these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And besides hauling away the people, like in conquest, the victors hauled home the spoils of war. And included among the loot taken to Babylon were the goblets and other sacred vessels used in the ceremonies of the temple at Jerusalem. Now, as a young man, Daniel and his friends appeared to have first been associated with the royal family in Judah. And they were either royal themselves, or they somehow, because of their qualifications, spent time in the palace. And because of their standing, then Daniel and the other 3 boys were taken into the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. And they were trained to give service to the empire. And with this great distinction, they dwelt in the royal palace, and they were fed the king's food. However, Daniel and his 3 friends did not want to dine on the king's food, and we assume that they did not want that cuisine because it was maybe had been sacrificed to idols. We don't know exactly, but they only wanted to eat vegetables and to drink water. And so after 10 days, they looked healthier than all the others who ate the king's rich food. Their future looked promising for Daniel and those 3 young men. Daniel 1 chapter 17 says, "To these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all types." Now in Daniel chapter 2, we read that Nebuchadnezzar experienced a certain dream that baffled and that troubled him. The king was so determined to find out about the meaning of his brain activity in the night that he called together all his advisors. And he said to them, "Tell me what this dream means." And they asked him, "Well, tell us about the dream so we can give some interpretation." And he was so concerned that they wouldn't just make something up, that they wouldn't just be yes men, that he told them, "I will not give you the dream. I want you to come back in the morning, tell me what the dream was, and tell me what the interpretation of that dream was." Now, included among those men who were tasked with that job of trying to know what the king had dreamt was Daniel and the other 3 young men. And so they went to the Lord in their hour of need, because the king had threatened to take their very lives if they would not provide this dream to him. And so they prayed to the Lord fervently, and the Lord, in his great providence, delivered the dream and the interpretation to Daniel. And so, the next morning, as Daniel returned to the court, and as all the other men could not give any type of description of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel stood up, and he told the king. He told him about a large statue made of gold and silver and iron and bronze. And God had made Nebuchadnezzar then to be like this statue, who would be honored. But in the time to come, Daniel said that there would be other emperors and other empires who would come to threaten Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, I should say, more importantly. And so we read here in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end. It will itself endure forever." And so this was the prophecy given with Nebuchadnezzar, that yes, that there would be some time when his kingdom would pass, but there would be this future kingdom that would have no end. Now, of course, King Nebuchadnezzar was greatly impressed, for that was the content of his dreams. And Daniel was honored, and God had chosen Nebuchadnezzar then to be this one who would have the power in that meantime, and the people would continue to honor him. And so King Nebuchadnezzar spontaneously made a confession of faith to the true Lord. He hadn't been a believer, but he was so impressed with Daniel's ability to interpret his dream that he said, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this secret." From almost dying with the other astronomers and astrologers in the court, Daniel was appointed to be the head advisor to the nation. And Daniel appointed then, in his authority, he appointed his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be regional advisors. And the prophecy seemed to come forward that things would look good for Daniel and his friends. But King Nebuchadnezzar's instant faith, that when he had been so impressed at first, that faith did not endure for the long time. Instead of continuing to give glory to God for Daniel's interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar got too stuck in the part about that God had chosen him to be the one to be honored. Never mind the God part, it was the Nebuchadnezzar part that he liked. And so he created a law that said, "All people in my kingdom shall bow down to this statue." And of course, there were some who would not do this. We remember then that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego found themselves in trouble, because there were the advisors who were loyal to the king, and they were glad to try to increase their standing in the society by following Nebuchadnezzar's insistence, and they were glad to bow down before this statue. And so they realized that Daniel and his friends, they were not going to do this, because they were true believers in God. They only worshiped the God of Israel. And so in their cunning and in their trickery, they appealed to Nebuchadnezzar. And so we get to this story here about how all the trickery. But first of all, we have to remind ourselves, excuse me, that wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. That was a different king. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So let's back up a little bit. So first we go back. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar has this vision. Daniel interprets it. He's appointed overseer. Then we get to the second dream. Now in the second dream, Nebuchadnezzar dreams that he sees this beautiful tree. And this tree had long branches where animals would come and find shelter in it, and the birds would flock to it. But then in this dream, the tree was cut down. And so King Nebuchadnezzar wanted some interpretation. What does this mean, that there's this tree and the birds find refuge in it and people find shade under it, but then it gets cut down? And so who do they talk to again? But they look to Daniel. And so Daniel gave an interpretation a second time. God could take away that throne. Just like how a lumberjack could cut that tree, so Nebuchadnezzar should be warned that God could take his kingdom away from him. And so we see the fulfillment of the second dream then, that King Nebuchadnezzar was still in power, but he began to become like an animal. A really strange story from the scriptures. He began to roam around on all fours and look like a beast, and to continue to live like an animal for some time, until the Lord felt that Nebuchadnezzar had learned his lesson, and he was allowed to stand up again. So in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar was so relieved that God had delivered him another time. First, from the terror of his dream. Secondly, from restoring him to being a human being. And so we even read in the book of Daniel that he gives this testimony. So here the second time he comes to faith. And we can read this in the scriptures, that he gives praise to God for delivering him from such calamity. But then Nebuchadnezzar grew old and died. And the next king to come to the throne was a man named Belshazzar. And that's where we get to our scripture reading today. That story of the handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar did not remember the lessons of the previous king, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar would learn the lesson, forget it, but then he seemed to make his way back. Belshazzar didn't have that luxury. And so we read in the 5th chapter of Daniel, like we heard this morning, that King Belshazzar and the royal court were having this large party, which was really something strange, considering that the Persians were coming in to attack them. They were in a time of war, but yet they decided this was a good time to have a party. And there was a large crowd, and they didn't have enough serving utensils, and so they decided, let's break into the vessels that had been taken when we had conquered Jerusalem all those years back. Those sacred vessels used for the ceremonies of the temple were now going to be used for this party. And so they took them out. And what made it even worse that they misused these vessels was that they used these sacred vessels and made toast to the gods of wood and stone and gold and silver and iron and bronze. And the Lord was very displeased that they had employed those vessels for that purpose. And so because of their profane use of those vessels, the writing literally was seen on the wall. And that's, of course, where we get that phrase from today. Many people use it having no idea that it comes from the scriptures. And so Belshazzar, as he saw that finger writing the text, he became very scared and frightened about these words. And, of course, once again, none of his men could read it except one. And who was that one, of course? But Daniel. And so Daniel was summoned, and he translated those words. And those words were written in Aramaic on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, uparsin. Or sometimes it's just written as parson in the scriptures too. Translated as divided, divided, weighed, wanting. And so Daniel did not only translate it, but he gave a prophecy concerning it. Daniel said, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now Belshazzar was so impressed, just like Nebuchadnezzar had been, that he made Daniel third in charge of the entire kingdom. But while Belshazzar heard that interpretation for that dream, it was not good for him, because it came to pass very quickly. And on that night, Darius, the king of Persia, invaded the city, and Belshazzar's days were at an end. So here comes another break in the story. So these have been Babylonian rulers, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. Now comes in from Persia, present-day Iran, into Babylon, present-day Iraq. And here comes Darius. And Darius was the one who brought with him these foreign advisors. You know, just like Daniel had been brought in from Israel, so now Darius had brought in his advisors from Persia. And they saw Daniel, and they saw Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, and they were so jealous of the attention that Daniel had for being third in the kingdom, how respected he was. And so they conspired. And here's where I got a little off track this morning. Here's where that comes in. And so they made this law. They appealed to Darius's ego and said, for just 1 month, sign a law saying only the people will worship you. And they knew that they could trap Daniel in that. And as he prayed on top of his roof, he was discovered, and they brought him into captivity, threw him into the lion's den. And we remember from that story that King Darius felt just terrible about this. Daniel was one of his cherished advisors. And now such a righteous man was going to be eaten alive. We know the end of this story. The angel appeared, the lion's mouth was shut. Here it was, King Darius, a man who had conquered Babylon, the great empire, but yet he could not reverse his own rule that he had signed. He had stamped it in the wax with the signet of his ring. Here he was so mighty in his military power, but he could not change a rule that he had decreed. So Daniel survived once again. First his life was in jeopardy when he had to provide that dream interpretation for Nebuchadnezzar, and here another time, and yet another time Daniel lived, and Daniel even lived to make it through another emperor of the Persians named Cyrus. It was customary then, remember when Daniel was in the lion's den, that when King Darius came that next morning, Daniel greeted him, but he still maintained that formality. Daniel still had that respect about him. And so when King Darius came that morning to the lion's den, Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever." And that's how they would greet people. At least in our modern day and age, when people honor the king there, it's a little bit more measured. They say long live the king, but they don't say live forever, because we know that kings do not live forever. Now most kings like this kind of praise. Who doesn't like to hear yourself be honored? Kings like to think of themselves, even though they know that they will die, they like to think of themselves as continuing to live through their offspring. And you'll hear many times, even like in revolutions, where the king will be threatened, and when he realizes that the end's up, he'll say, well, okay, I'll leave, but you put my son on the throne, or I'll leave and you put my grandson on the throne, always hoping that would somehow placate the people. That's the way it goes, that people think of the king as living on through his descendants. And there have been many monarchies that have lasted throughout many centuries. The world's oldest monarchy that still is in authority is the Japanese monarchy. But the kings and queens of Japan, even though their ancestors can be traced back to before the time of Christ, they are not powerful kings. Their throne is called the chrysanthemum throne, but yet they exercise no real power, just like the British monarchs. Their ceremonies are largely for public show and not for decreeing any laws. There is only one true and powerful king in this world, and that king, of course, is Jesus Christ. Jesus is not your typical king. He's not the one whose kingdom is of this world, as he said to Pilate. Jesus is still king whether you bow down to him or not. See, earthly kings do not have that same luxury. A revolution can start up and depose them from the throne, but not so with Christ. Belshazzar saw the writing on the wall. He knew his time was up. Darius could do nothing to pull his advisor Daniel from the lion's den. But Christ is the king to whom we should say, long live the king, or better yet, O king, live forever, because he does reign. His reign has no beginning and ending date. He always reigns. It is a good thing then to acknowledge Christ as being the true king of your life, even if it means not having a comfortable life, even if it means not having a peaceful life. The Christian life in many ways is like a soldier. And we sing that in our hymns, onward Christian soldiers. Crowns and thrones may perish, kingdoms wax and wane, but the church of Jesus, constant, shall remain. Many emperors and empresses look so glorious in their portraits and in their pictures, but their reign does not endure like Christ, the one who reigns forever and ever. Now Daniel did not live forever. He lived beyond many of these kings. He outlived Nebuchadnezzar, he outlived Belshazzar, he outlived Darius, and he even lived into the time of Cyrus. And it is from that connection between Babylon in Israel to Babylon to Persia, that we see how Christ's reign comes into all this. For we remember that the Magi were thought to have traveled from Persia. The Magi were astronomers, astrologers, just like Daniel had been one who could interpret dreams, interpret the stars. And we see that Daniel was a type of sage here as well. All throughout these first 5 chapters of the book of Daniel, we heard about him, being in company with the astronomers. And then the other stargazers couldn't figure things out, but Daniel could. Daniel was the one who was called upon to give an explanation. In chapter 9 of Daniel, Daniel makes a prophecy looking forward, going now beyond the book of Daniel into the life of Christ, giving a prophecy. Daniel chapter 9, 70, like the number 70, sevens, like 70 times 7, are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, in his commentary on the book of Daniel, Martin Luther noticed that if you counted from Daniel's time unto the start of Christ's time, that it equals roughly 490 years, 70 times 7. And so we could see that even though Daniel lived hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born in Bethlehem, that the Messiah would come, one whose reign and kingship could not be ultimately threatened. And when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, after following the star, that same kind of dreamlike activity started to happen. Again, we remember the story of Christmas. King Herod felt threatened. These wise men came following a star. We want to worship the king, they told him. And besides talking about the star, they talked about wanting to find where he was so they could honor him. And Herod pretended to be interested so that he could take out this king, because he was jealous. He was jealous, just like previous kings had been. The book of Matthew tells us then that Jesus and his family fled to Egypt. Well, first of all, they were warned in a dream, just like in Daniel's time, to leave. And then when it was time to come back again, they were also warned by an angel that it was, not warned, but informed that they would be safe. And then, of course, finally, King Herod was not able to get a hold of baby Jesus. But he killed the other baby boys, just as Daniel's life had been threatened if he did not provide this interpretation. Now, the deliverance of the baby Jesus certainly brings to mind the stories of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, the ones who were thrown in that fiery furnace. The lions would not consume Daniel. We see the miracles continue on and on. So Daniel and his young men, they were kept safe. Yes, Daniel lived through many generations, administrations of rulers. But we know that Jesus is the only one who lives and reigns in eternity. And Jesus did not live long on this earth like Daniel. Jesus lived, 30-some years. And what about those who came after Jesus' time? Those who were martyrs for the faith, not fed to one lion, but were fed to many lions in the Colosseums at Rome, where people watched the lions come devour the Christians like they were watching a football game. Sometimes God preserves his children in this earth, and other times they suffer for his glory. And so it is for each one of us. Going through life is not ultimately an accomplishment of living a long earthly existence like Daniel did. Yes, it is a blessing to enjoy long years, but it does not mean that God cannot use a short life. Life is not measured as a success by simply making it to another year. The Lord used Daniel as witness because Daniel and his 3 friends did what was right. They would only worship the one true God. But God can be glorified both in a short life and in a death, and in a long life, like Daniel's was. So the book of Romans reminds each one of us, young and old alike, whether we live, we are the Lord's. Whether we die, we are the Lord's. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. See, because of Christ the King, you can have total confidence that God is always with you, and that in whatever situation you find yourself in life on this planet, God will make a way. Whether your life will be short or long, whether you associate with important folks like Daniel did in getting to be third in the royal court, or whether all of your friends in life are a group of nobodies, God is faithful. God will not abandon you. God can use your life, no matter how large or small or long or short that it is, to be a witness. It might be like the way Daniel was, living long. It might be like Jesus was, living short. God can work through the mistakes of kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Certainly God can work through the mistakes that you have made in your life. Even when King Nebuchadnezzar received a magnificent vision showing how God had appointed him and appointed him to be king, he turned it around to glorify himself. And so often we do the same. You know, you've been given gifts, you've been given talents, and what do? You might use them in the right service, but then you start to have the wrong attitude about them. You think about, oh, how talented I am or whatever, you know. You have those passing thoughts. Pride always comes to the heart. Think about King Darius, how he was tricked into signing a decree. He created his own problem. He didn't even realize it. Too many times in your life, you have been the victim of the same kind of trouble. You've made poor decisions that have affected things that have messed up your life. You've created your own problems. Yet God still has a way to continue to work through you in spite of your circumstances. So even when you get yourself really into a complicated situation, there is still a way that God can rescue you from your problems. Let him guide you. And then afterwards, you can glorify God for forgiving and delivering you from your foolishness. Just like Nebuchadnezzar. Twice that God had provided these great blessings for him, you know, giving him this dream of that people would bow down to him. And what did he do? He just looked for the honor for himself. You and I do the same thing. But yet, in our foolishness and your foolishness, just like in his foolishness, God can still forgive you. For God uses the foolishness of the world to make men wise, as the scriptures tell us. So praise be to God that his Son, Jesus Christ, is a powerful enough king to not only redeem you from your sins, but that our Lord is merciful enough to deliver you from whatever evil has trapped your life. And when the end of ages comes, and when the stars begin to fall, and the trumpet sounds, and our Lord descends on the clouds, you will be rescued if you are looking for a rescuer. That you will be kept safe from harm, because God is not only the Lord of this world, but he is the Lord of the life to come. So praise be to Christ, who is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.